Okay, we are, for the past 2 weeks, if you remember, we've been looking at Paul. Paul has been speaking his personal testimony. He's been speaking the gospel message to King Agrippa, to his sister Bernice, to Festus, and to all the important people in Caesarea, both Jew and Gentile. And Paul was using this opportunity to witness his faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And he's telling them that's who that was. Well, Festus, Bernice, and Agrippa all seem to reject what Paul is telling them. Especially Festus, he even speaks up about it. But they did make arrangements to have Paul and his followers travel by ship some 2,000 miles to Rome. So that's been done. And this was all happening around the year 60. All right? And as we start into Acts 27 today, which is what we'll be in Acts 27 for the next couple of weeks. But as we start in Acts 27, I want you all to know that this is one of the most detailed portions of Scripture. Luke was a very careful historian, and he was making this trip with Paul. You know, he was riding along with Paul on this ship. And the details that Luke gives us in this chapter about the ancient methods of sailing gives more insight into the sailing practices of the sailing in the Mediterranean Sea in the first century than basically all other manuscripts combined. Historians and archaeologists have gone to this chapter in Acts and studied this passage for its valuable description of ancient seamanship. So we're going to be dealing a lot with seamanship in Acts 27. But I want you to remember, Luke was not a sailor. What was he? He was a doctor. Yeah, he was a doctor. He was a landlubber. He didn't go to sea. But because he was such a careful historian, we all benefit from his detailed writing. You know, the ancients generally had no love for the sea. The ships were very uncomfortable, and it was not easy to travel by sea. The navigators had no compasses, they had no sextants, they sailed by the stars and the sun, and by land as they saw it. So it wasn't easy for them to get to navigate, so it was not an easy way to go. All right, so let's start in Acts 27, read verse 1 and 2. I think you have that, don't you, Roger?
When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and embarking on an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica.
Okay, so here we see that it was decided that they would sail to Rome. And they take Paul and the other prisoners, these are other prisoners who had appealed to Caesar, so they're all going to Rome on this ship. Okay, so maybe the other prisoners had accusations against them to present to Nero. But last we read, they didn't really have anything. Neither Festus nor Agrippa saw Paul as worthy of death or imprisonment. They saw him as innocent. So, one way or another, Festus must have come up with some way to explain why Paul was coming to Rome. Okay, we don't know. He must have some way to explain to Caesar why he was there. And Paul was being sent to Rome as a prisoner. Okay? So how is it then if Paul is going by ship to Rome as a prisoner, how is it that both Luke and Aristarchus can come with him? I mean, some surmise that Luke went along as Paul's personal physician. And some say that Aristarchus was his servant. And then when you have that, that's an official title, so those people can go with, they get to go with you, I guess, because you're appealing to Caesar. You're a prisoner. I don't think you're in chains, but you're a prisoner still. But it must have been God working all this out to get these three men to Rome. And we know Luke, he's writing this account, and he lived in Caesarea, where he had joined up with Paul to document his ministry. Aristarchus was a man Paul had met in Thessalonica on his second missionary journey. And Aristarchus had kept up with him and been with him all the time since he met Jesus through Paul. So I believe that as we see these men accompanying Paul all the way to Rome on a prisoner ship, we see a wonderful demonstration of the Christian love that these three men shared for God and for each other. You know, there were other prisoners on the ship, and they were all under the authority of Julius. And he was a centurion, and a centurion is a man who commands 100 men. Well, Julius was part of the Augustan cohort of the Roman military. The Augustan cohort was a very prestigious unit. It was a hand-picked body of soldiers who were responsible directly to the emperor. So this is very important. God gave Paul favor in the eyes of Julius. This centurion, we're going to see as we go along, will develop a deep respect for Paul. And he will extend several liberties to Paul that maybe others don't get. He will take his advice and he will make efforts to actually protect Paul. And the intention of this voyage was to sail from port to port, and they would hope to connect to another ship that was headed to Rome. They don't really, this isn't like today. We don't have this plan. You go from here to New York, you take this to New York to Paris. And, you know, here they were going from port to port, hoping to find a ship that they could take on to Rome. At this time, there were no passenger ships, guys. They just didn't have those. So they had to rely on transport ships that were headed in the direction they were going. And of course, they were trying to get to Italy. They were trying to get to Rome. And right now, they were on a ship called the Adramyttian, which is a city port in what is now modern-day Turkey. The city has since disappeared, but there is a city inland about 13 miles. But the Adramyttian is now gone. But it was around at that time.
What city is that on this map?
Adramyttian, I don't know that Adramyttian is on this map.
There's another city name.
Adramyttian is up, I want to say it's up around Mysia and Pergamum, up in that area. That's where Adramyttian is. Yeah. I forgot to look that city up exactly, but I know it's on the top of Asia Minor. Okay, up in that area. All right, let's read Acts 27 verse 3.
The next day we put in at Sidon, and Judas treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends to receive care.
All right, so here we see the first leg of the journey from Rome was from Caesarea to Sidon. And you can see on your map, Sidon is just north of Tyre. All right? Now, this was Paul's first known visit to Sidon. But we know that after Stephen's martyrdom, the new Christians scattered from Jerusalem. You remember they scattered from Jerusalem, and many of them went into Phoenicia. And Sidon is in Phoenicia. So that's why Paul has friends here. He knows people here. So, but what's interesting is, it says Julius treated Paul with consideration. So here's one of those times. I mean, Julius is letting Paul and his friends go out and visit friends while they're at this port. I mean, to me, that's a strange thing for a Roman centurion to do, because Roman soldiers had very strict rules about prisoners. If a Roman soldier lost a prisoner, he would be forced to serve the prisoner's sentence. And Julius let Paul go ashore. He could have run away. But I think he trusted that Paul was not going to do that. And he probably went with his two cohorts, Aristarchus and Luke. All right, so let's go on to verse 4 and 5.
From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. Okay.
Now, if you look at your maps here, the fourth journey, the journey to Rome, is in gold. But look at the third journey where they came home from Myra all the way to Tyre. Okay. Now that's the route they would have been taking. They would have been going directly from Sidon, following that blue route all the way up to Myra. Okay, that was the normal route. It was a direct course from Sidon to Myra, leaving Cyprus on the starboard side of the ship, which is the starboard side. Huh?
Right.
The right. It'll be on the starboard side of the ship. But because the winds were contrary, they had to sail under the shelter of Cyprus. And what that meant is the shelter of Cyprus, they went around Cyprus on the north. They went closer to Cilicia and Pamphylia. They just ran, the winds ran against them as they attempted to sail in open water, so they had to block the winds with Cyprus. That's what they did. And they were hoping the winds would subside, but they never did, or they didn't for that time. And the word contrary is the Greek word enantios, which means opposite or against. And the winds ran against them as they tried to move forward. Now, it forced the captain to sail where he had to sail. And had it not been for these strong western winds, they had to leave Cyprus on the port side because of these strong winds. Had it not been for these strong winds, they would have sailed all the way in open seas. And sailing under the shelter of Cyprus was allowing the strong winds to be blocked by the island, but I already told you that. And they do make it to the next port, Myra. Historians tell us that normally it would take about 9 days to get from Myra to Sidon, or whichever way they're going from Sidon to Myra. But they tell us it should take about 9 days. It probably took them longer because of these winds. This was a single-masted ship, and it was not. It was difficult for them to make headway with these strong northwestern winds. All right, let's read verse 6. You got that, Roger?
Yeah. The centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard.
All right, so, and they arrive in Myra, okay? The centurion goes around, that's what I said. They get from port to port, and they have to find a ship that will take them where they need to go. So the centurion leaves, and he goes around trying to find a ship, and he finds an Alexandrian ship that was laden down with wheat that was headed to Italy. So they board that ship, and these large ships were big. They were 180 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 44 feet deep from deck to hull. All right, now verse 7 and 8, who's got that?
Me. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea.
Yeah, Roman ships, as I said, were very large because they were carrying all this grain and different things they needed in Italy and in Rome. And they were loaded down with this grain, and they displaced a lot of water. And as I said, they have a single mast with a large square sail. And sailors want the wind to be behind them with a single sail like that because it's straight across. And but the wind was against them. And what we from this writing, we see Luke telling us they sailed slowly for a good many days. We have no idea how long that is, a good many days. But most of what when I studied this, they said it was probably about 2 to 3 weeks. Because they were fighting it, and the distance they were going was only 120 miles, but it was taking them a very long time to make that trip. And then from Myra to Cnidus, it was 120 miles. But because of the winds, they could go no further. So they sailed south because they couldn't get any further. If you look at that map, they sailed south instead of going on straight across. They had to sail south toward Crete, and they were being blocked. They were being hurt by these winds, and they sailed down to Crete to try and again go under Crete to block the winds. So they go around the eastern side of Crete, and they pass Salmone, but they did it with great difficulty because these winds were probably very strong. And then they sailed on to Fair Havens, and you can see Fair Havens. Crete is a 140-mile long island, so they're about halfway there at Fair Havens. But they did it with difficulty. All right, now let's read 9 and 10.
When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of cargo and the ship, but also our lives.
All right, this Alexandrian ship had lost so much time due to the contrary winds that it was evident now to the captain that they would not be able to reach Rome. They're going to have to winter someplace, and they're on the island of Crete. they're gonna have to winter there and finish the journey in the spring. An ancient writer, Vigesius, wrote, up to September, sailing was safe on the Mediterranean. Then, from September 14th to November, it was very dangerous. And that's pretty much what Paul, or that's what pretty much what Luke is saying here. He says that after when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous. And that's exactly what Vigesius had said. But Vigesius went a little further in his writing, and he said after November 11th, then sailing was impossible. So see, we think, I mean, yes, today we can sail in these places, but they still have the same winds. But we have much more power, and these were just sail ships. So they could not, from November to March, they could not sail in the Mediterranean. And I never knew that until I looked at all this. And it's here in Scripture that they couldn't do it. They find themselves in Fairhaven, and Fairhaven is not a desirable place to spend the winter because it's on the south side of Crete, and it's exposed to the open sea, and it's a pretty small port, which was not a great place to stay. And we don't know how long they stayed in Fairhaven. Some of the people that I read said they probably stayed there about a month, trying to wait for calmer weather. And Luke tells us that even since the fast was already over. Now, what fast do you think that was?
The Day of Atonement.
There you go. You had a note, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I'm trying to.
Yeah. That fast is the Day of Atonement, and since it had already passed, they were going to get there for that anyway. So what we're looking at here is we know that the Day of Atonement occurred on the 10th day of Tishri, right? The 10th day of Tishri puts their journey at the end of September or sometime into October. So see, they're into that time of the year where it's getting dangerous to be on the sea, okay? But then Paul speaks up, okay? And he speaks to the sailors and he says, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only to the cargo, but also of our lives." Now, this again is interesting. Here you have a prisoner trying to tell the captain it's not a good idea that we go out in that sea. Okay? He's giving advice to the sailors. I mean, he's giving his opinion. But one thing we do need to remember, Paul's been on 2 shipwrecks already. And he's probably been on shipwrecks because of this same thing, you know. And he's saying it's not good. So he's telling them that. And you know, Paul knew that God told him that he would make it to Rome, didn't he? He told him, you're going to be my minister in Rome. So he knows that he's going to make it to Rome, but he doesn't know when. So he doesn't know what he's got to go through. But he's saying, you know, if we go with this, we're going to have a shipwreck. So we probably don't want to do that. And he's just giving them advice. Paul's concern was for them, not for himself. Okay? All right, let's read 11 and 12.
But the centurion was more persuaded by the Bible and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing south, west, and northwest, and spend the winter there.
Yeah, so the centurion here's what Paul is saying. But is he going to take the advice of a prisoner, or is he going to take the advice of the captain and the pilot? You know, I mean, who would you take advice from? Yeah, I mean, and you're not a believer, so you know. Even if you're a believer, he's a landlubber, not a captain. Okay, so the centurion is more persuaded by the captain, and that this was not a place to overwinter. The only place suitable on Crete, on the southern side of Crete, you can see right there, is Phoenix, the port of Phoenix, and it was not on the map, so I added it. So they're going to head off to Phoenix, but they had to wait for the weather or the winds to be right. And so that's what they're doing. Phoenix is about 40 miles from Fairhaven, so it shouldn't take long to get there. Okay? Now let's read 13 through 15.
When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before very long, when there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euphila, and when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along.
Yeah, so the captain and the pilot then decide to continue on for a better overwintering port, the port of Phoenix. And there was a change in the force and direction of the wind, okay? A south wind has come up, and they decided to go ahead and sail on. I mean, it's not the right time of year, but they decided the winds are good, so let's go. And for a time, it looked great. I mean, they were doing super. But before they made it to the harbor, the wind suddenly rushed down on them from the land. Okay, now this is Crete, and Crete is very mountainous right down there on that side. So what happens is, the nice southerly breezes turn into a fierce squall from the northeast, sweeping down on them from the mountains. All right? Now, what was hitting them is called a Euraquilo. A Euraquilo is a strong northeasterly wind, and it's an interesting name because it comes from Latin and Greek. The Greek word is Euros, which means east, and aquilo is Latin and it means north. So it's a northeasterly, right? It's a northeastern wind, and these northeastern winds were so fierce that they had the intensity of a hurricane or a typhoon. The Euraquilo winds brought great fear among those who sailed the Mediterranean because it tended to sink ships because it's that strong. It's a typhoon, that comes all of a sudden. You're sailing along real nice, and all of a sudden this typhoon comes and hits you. All right, let's continue on 16, 17.
Running under the shelter of a small island called Kuda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, we used some wooden cables and undergirded the ship. And fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of the Sirtis, they let down the sea anchor, because in this way, let themselves be driven in.
All right, so Luke tells us that the ship was caught in the great wind, and all they could do is let themselves be driven by it. There's not much they could do, okay? And as they approached the small island of Cluda, and you can see Cluda down there, it's about 25 miles south of Crete, they ran under it, again, to block the winds, okay? Instead of going in the open sea, which would be tough on them, they went around Cluda so that they could block the winds. And even on the leeward side of the island, they struggled to get the ship's skiff back up on the ship. I mean, this is I had a tough time with this verse because it says, they running under the shelter of a small island called Cluda, they were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. And I thought that would meant the boat that they're in. And it is possibly, but really, then it said after they had hoisted it up, they're not hoisting up their ship, they're hoisting up their boat, their skiff. Because what they did is they towed a smaller boat behind them that they would use to go from the ship to the mainland. And to me, that was it just took me a while to figure all that out. Judy came in, she figured it out quick. I said, yeah, I think I got that.
I looked it up.
And so it is a smaller boat that they were able to skiff, that they were able to pull up onto the boat. And after they had hoisted up the skiff, they undergirded the ship. And what undergirding ship means is they would pass a large cable-laid rope around the hull of the ship 4 or 5 times to hold it together, because these single-masted ships could easily break apart in these bad storms. Even bigger ships had a better distribution of their weight, and so they wouldn't break apart as easily. But even this 180-foot ship was a single-masted, and it would easily break apart from these typhoon winds. So what they do is they wrap the rope around. Some say under, some say around. I'm not sure how they exactly do it. But the procedures today are called frapping. You frap a ship by wrapping ropes around it. And because this ship was single-masted, they were afraid it would split in half. So they did this. The crew would frap the ship, and they would put the large ropes around it, and the ship had a better chance of surviving the storm. So that's all these things that they're doing.
Did the ropes go under the ship?
Well, I've read 2 different ways. I would have no idea how many storm they would get ropes under the ship. So I read somebody else said they put it around the ship. Because see, either way, they're holding the ship together, right? So because it would have a tendency to split apart in these typhoon winds. Yeah, how can you get a rope under the ship?
Well, you just get at the front of it and they hold it and then let it out and walk backwards.
Yeah.
Person on each side.
Yeah. So
Yeah, like a jump rope.
they could let it go, and that might be how they did it. They could have. They knew how to do that, and I've read lots of different places trying to find out how they do that, and I couldn't. I couldn't get an actual definition of how they did it, but they wrapped it around the ship. All right, let's see. Yeah, what Luke says is that they feared that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis. Now, this probably refers to the dreaded sandbars and shoals off the African coast, west of Cyrene. And on your map, you can see where Cyrene is. It's in what's now called Libya. But that off of Libya, there are great big sandbars and shoals, which is what the people in those days dreaded, because going near there could mean getting grounded. Well, they let down the sea anchor and lowered the sails. Now, they would have lowered the sails some, because they have to have control over the ship, but they would lower it down to not have the full force of the winds. And then they put out the sea anchor. Now, a sea anchor is a broad piece of wood that was held down by a weight vertically and had barrels attached to it that would catch the water and slow the boat down. It would give them better control on how to do all this. And that's why I say all this stuff Luke puts in here, it's amazing, because that gives people the idea exactly what people did when they got into these bad storms. With the sail lowered and with the storm swirling around them, they really had very little ability to navigate, and those sea anchors helped them, but it was very tough what they were doing. All right, let's go on to 18 through 20.
The next day, as we were being violently storm tossed, they began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, as we went on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned.
All right, so times were getting very tough. The situation was very desperate here. And they got the crew, they probably got the prisoners, everybody was throwing stuff overboard, okay? Because they're trying to save themselves, they're trying to make the ship lighter. And they would throw off excess tackle, they would throw off any unnecessary sails, they'd throw off cables, they'd throw off furniture, they'd throw off everything they could throw off to get the weight of the boat to be less. And the ship sailed, the ship actually sailed under the stars, didn't it? In the sun. And they're not seeing the stars or the sun right now. Because in the daytime, it's cloudy, and in the nighttime, it's cloudy, so they don't see either. So it's very difficult for them to be going, and the men on the ship lost all hope of being saved, of making it through the storm. All right, let's read verse 21. Who's got that?
When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail for Crete and incurred this damage and loss."
Yeah, times are getting real tough on this ship.
Great PR.
That was a long way to say.
I told you so.
We're going to get to that, okay? They had gone a long time without food, okay? And Paul speaks out again. He says, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not set sail from Crete." Now, ought there is the Greek word D. And D means divine necessity. This actually points to the revelatory quality of his prior warning. And he's really not telling them, "I told you so." Although it seems like he's telling them, "I told you so." But his words are basically trying to motivate these people that, "I told you this before, it has happened. Please listen to me now." Okay? And because he's not trying to get at them and tell them, "I told you so." He wants them to listen to what God is telling them now. Okay? Because he's got a lot more things to say. All right, so let's read 22 through 24.
"Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you.'"
Yeah, just as he had heard an angel in Corinth, remember when he got the message from the angel in Corinth, Paul had another visitation from an angel. And he told him to stop being afraid. And this is a good time to be told not to stop being afraid, because they were all afraid. I mean, this had to be a terrible situation. And he reiterated the divine plan that he must, that's the Greek word die again, that he must stand trial before Nero, before Caesar. And he also tells them that no life will be lost. The ship will be lost, but no lives will be lost. But who does Paul say told him to do this?
God.
Who? Yeah, he
God
told,
through the angel.
yeah, an angel of the God to whom I belong and serve. Okay? Now this is not their God, but he is his God, right? And this is Paul's position. He belonged to Yahweh, to the Lord. And he regards God as the owner of himself. And he tells them that this is the God whom I serve, and that is Paul's practice. He serves God. He knows that his life belongs to God, and that he lived his life in service to God. And friends, that's what we should do. Now we all belong to God. We all belong to God, and we should all live our lives to serve him. Okay? And that's what Paul's doing here. And then he tells them that God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. And you know what that means. Not only are Paul and his men going to survive, but everyone on the ship is going to survive. The ship will perish, but they will survive because God has granted you, is what he says. Now, granted you is the perfect middle indicative tense of the Greek word charizomai, which comes from cherish. And what is cherish? Cherish is grace. So basically he's saying God is giving us this grace gift. We are being saved by God. And the lives of those saved with Paul were spared because God was giving them a grace gift. And Paul's been praying to God, and God has answered. Because of this one man's prayer, 275 men are going to be saved as a result of this. All right, so let's go on to Acts 25 and 26, the last two verses.
Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.
Yeah, so here we go. Paul continues. He says, be cheerful, because that says, keep up your courage. That word actually means be cheerful. But it also means have courage. Be cheerful and be strong. Have courage. That's what that word means. And Paul's telling them, he's telling them that faith exists in understanding God's words. God said it. I believed it. That's faith. That's what he's telling them. And he says faith is accepting the teaching of God's words. Now these people aren't Christian. They're not even Jew. They don't understand this God. But Paul's telling them that God had told us to stay in Fairhaven, and we didn't do that. Now, listen to him. We must run aground. Trust my God. It's going to turn out exactly as he told me. So, what are the chances that this is going to happen? I mean, what are the chances that this would actually work? Mathematically, it's probably staggering that it could possibly work. But with God, it's no big deal, is it? He's going to take care of it, and we'll continue that next time. Any questions? All right, great. Let's pray.
Thank you.
Let's pray.